Hey dorks, I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, so computers have always been a part of my life. From the days where I'd watch my dad play computer games and beg to join in, to now where I do stupid stuff with old computers, they've always been there. My first computer was my dad's old Commodore VIC-20. He graduated to the Commodore 64 and a Tandy 1000, but I stuck with the VIC for the majority of my childhood. At school we had Apple IIs and Macintosh machines, and this is where my computer hobby became an all-out obsession. Each classroom at my school had a Mac Plus and an Apple II in the back, and our computer labs were all decked out with Mac Pluses and SEs, with a forbidden 2CI at the end of the table that we weren't allowed to touch. The library had one LC with an external CD-ROM drive for looking things up in the digital encyclopedia. The library also had issues of Mac User and Macworld that I'd read cover to cover, learning about all these expensive products I wish I could play with. As an adult, I've had the opportunity to check out all this stuff and build a nice collection of Macs and other computers I consider to be influential in my youth. But at the time, school was the only opportunity to play with Macs. As I got older and could afford to get my own computer stuff, I ended up getting into PCs. Even though Windows had matured enough by the time Windows 95 came out, I still wished I had a way to own a Mac. Unfortunately, in 1997, when I had enough money to build my own computer, Macs and even the Mac clones were still a bit out of my price range, so I built a PC instead. I talk about that PC in my last video, so if you missed it, check it out. Today there are tons of different options for running various Mac OS releases on PC. There's Open Core Legacy Patcher for running the current Mac OS natively, QEMU for running PowerPC versions of both OS X and 9, Sheepshaver for emulating the old PowerPC Mac software, Basilisk for 68K based Macs, and Mini VMac for the really old ones. Back then there was only one native PC option that I knew about, and it was a weird one called Executor. Executor? I like Executor. This one didn't function the way most emulators do when you emulate the hardware to trick the OS into working. This was a software implementation of the Macintosh toolbox and OS, so you could run Mac programs. It was expensive at nearly $300, so it was out of reach to all but the most moneyed or most waresy folks of the time. I'll let you figure out which of those categories I fit into. I briefly tried this way back then, but the graphics looked weird and corrupted, and it just wasn't the Mac OS experience I was looking for. Concurrent to all this, there was another computer out there that was pretty much overlooked in the States, and that machine is the Commodore Amiga. It was built on the same CPU as the Mac, had a big focus on gaming, and in the early 90s the graphics were out of this world. My dad and I were always talking about how cool the Amiga looked when we watched an old game show on Nickelodeon called Nick Arcade. Contestants on the show were put into the video games to compete against each other for prizes. The games the kids were playing and the show itself were made on Amigas. I've still to this day never even seen an Amiga in person, but back in 1998 I got my first taste by messing around with an emulator for PC called WinUAE. The desktop environment and software packages available for it felt completely alien to me, but in a neat, this needs to be explored kind of way. Then I discovered that there was a nice little program called Shapeshifter available that let you run Mac System 7 on Amiga hardware. Running an emulator within an emulator? Could that really work? I had to try, so I did. I wanted to set some ground rules for this endeavor. First and foremost, everything I did had to be possible back in the period this PC was in its heyday, so the software I'm using needs to be old versions from back in 1998. The second rule was that I didn't want to use a pre-configured hard disk image where Mac OS was already installed. I wanted to do the install straight in the emulator. This rule applied to the Amiga side of things as well. To get started, I scoured the internet for old versions of WinUAE. I found a website called Amiga Emulation Universe, linked below, that had a ton of old releases of WinUAE, and I settled on version 0.8.6R6 from December 19, 1998. I actually tried a few versions previous to this one as well, but they only had a command line interface for configuring the emulator, and there are a lot of settings to tweak and keep track of, so I used the earliest version with a GUI I could find. Shapeshifter was a little harder to track down. Version 3.11 is readily available, but that was released in 2001. After getting advice from my friend Sloopy Malibu, I searched through the Aminet CDs on the Internet Archive until I found version 3.9, which came out on April 28, 1998. Installation of WinUAE is straightforward. To run it, you'll need an Amiga ROM. I went with the Kickstart 3.1 ROM. You'll need to find that one on your own, or dump it from a real Amiga. I also went with Workbench 3. Again, I'll leave that one up to you to find if you want to play along. You'll also need a Macintosh ROM. I went with an LC ROM since I'm emulating a 68020. As far as settings, I set chip RAM to 2 megs, fast RAM to 8 megs, and slow RAM to 1 meg. I don't really know what I'm doing here since I'm an Amiga noob, so these were just the settings that got me the most available RAM. Then I pointed it to my Kickstart ROM file. For the CPU, I chose a 68020 with 24-bit addressing and fastest possible emulation speed. For display, I switched the screen resolution to 640 by 480 and set line mode to doubled with both centering selections to smart. I turned sound emulation to the emulated setting, ejected all of the floppies, and designated a directory on my machine to act as the hard drive for the Amiga emulator. This was preferable to me, so I could do lots of file manipulation of the Amiga environment in Windows instead of doing it on the virtual Amiga. Then I just named the configuration, saved it, and fired up my fake Amiga for the first time. Amiga without a Workbench installed is pretty bare bones. You just get a command prompt. Luckily, I had floppy images for the installation of Workbench. I put them in one by one and breezed through the install. After that, I had a fresh, clean Workbench to mess around with. Shapeshifter came compressed as an LHA file. On Windows 98, I didn't know how to extract this, but 7-zip on my modern PC can open it, so I extracted it there along with Macintosh System 701 install floppy images and copied them over to my 98 PC. I needed to put the files in the Amiga file system, so I navigated there, put the Shapeshifter folder, drawer, into the root of my Amiga hard drive. There's a small Kickstart patch that comes with Shapeshifter that needs to run on boot called Prepare Emule. It's in the Shapeshifter drawer by default, but to be run from the command line it needs to be placed in the C drawer. The Macintosh ROM also needs to be renamed Shapeshifter ROM and dropped into the Shapeshifter drawer. I fired up the Amiga again and right-clicked to bring up the menu at the top and chose Execute Command from the Workbench menu to run the Prepare Emule A1200 command. The Amiga will reboot with a rainbow pattern if this worked, and then Shapeshifter's ready to run. I navigated to the Shapeshifter drawer and started it up. The settings menu is displayed at this point. I left graphics settings at their defaults. Under Volumes and Disks, I set the Disk Tools disk from the Mac System 701 as File Disk 1, and clicked Create for File Disk 2 to make an 80 MB virtual hard drive for the virtual Mac. For memory settings, I chose 4 MB and didn't change any other settings. I clicked Start from the main menu, and much to my delight, it booted right up in a minimal install of System 7 on the floppy image. Here I was given the opportunity to format my virtual hard drive, so I did. Shut down my virtual Mac and restarted it, this time with the first System 7 install disk, and started an install. Here's where I hit my first snag. I don't know if there's any way to switch disk image files while the emulator's running, but I couldn't find one. When the installer asked to switch disks, I was stopped in my tracks. On a real Amiga, I could just do this with real Mac disks in the floppy drive, so I tried just renaming the disk image from .img to .adf and mounted that in the Amiga emulator and set Shapeshifter up to use the Amiga disk drives, but got nowhere. So here's when things get really convoluted. Since Shapeshifter only gives you 2 file disks, and one of them has to be the hard drive, I started things off by booting with the Disk Utilities floppy image, copied its system folder over to the hard drive, and shut down. Now I would boot from that hard drive 5 times, once with each of the installed disks, and copy the contents of each disk to a folder. Then create a new blank file disk, run the installer from the first one, and install the OS to the second one, and to my surprise, it actually worked. Back in school, we didn't get the opportunity to play a lot of games, but there were a few times we could get away with it, and Glypha was by far the most popular. Glider was also fairly common. I was just as terrible at Shufflepuck back then as I am now. These games are great and everything, but I wonder if there's something else I could do. I'm just scratching the surface as far as this goes. My Amiga environment is still mostly at default settings. I'm sure if I tweaked some stuff I could get more colors and better performance, which would increase the performance on the Mac side of things, but I'm just excited I was able to get to this point. Thanks for watching. If you want more stupid stuff with computers, stick around.